Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well. I just wanted to say as a thought that I had, remember that if there's bad times, it's extremely important just to focus on getting through them and putting in the work, whatever you need to do at the time to make things better. Because oftentimes it's, especially if you're mentally unwell, it's out of your control how you feel during them, especially if you know that you've done everything to help. So something I find extremely useful is just focusing on getting through it and making sure I put the work in. Because the way I look at it is I could have a time that I feel really down and I get nothing done, or have a time where I'm down but I've also managed to get through it doing work and it leads me to a better position. And overall it helps me in the long run, like massively. And remember too, if you don't feel right, even if you just think it's a little thing that might be wrong with you, make sure you go and seek professional help for it. I mean, I remember the first time I've become aware that I had severe social anxiety after years of suffering from it was literally just because a random video got suggested on it, but I had no idea what it was, and the second I got help, it was unbelievable, especially with that. So I really recommend anyone, even if you just have a suspicion that something isn't right, it might not be right, and it might just be masked through time and you thinking it's normal. Like for me, I just thought, oh, I'm naturally an anxious person and that's just how I am and been all my life. But I didn't realize cognitively I was actually dysfunctional in that sense. Well, not dysfunctional, but you know what I mean. But yeah, I just thought that might help someone. So I hope you enjoyed this compilation. I love you and I'll speak to you soon. Road to 100k, we almost there. Let's go. This happened in the summer in northern Ontario, Canada, near the town of Parry Sound. Me and my friend had headed up north to spend some time at my grandpa's cabin. He shares it with a few other hunters next to a very big lake. You need to take a boat to get to the cabin, I mean. I had gone up there a few weeks prior just to wander around and help my dad with some repairs and improvements to the cabin. I looked on a printout of a satellite map, and I found the area that the cabin's in. There was no Wi-Fi in the cabin, and it's sort of in a valley, and it was very hard to get any sort of signal in. And I noticed that there was a small lake north of the one we're at, and there was a small island inside the lake. Me and my dad go to the boat and found a nice pristine little island. We don't actually go on it though. We can see that there's some swampy areas and a small fiberglass boat that hunters use to hunt ducks sometimes. The lake was much higher than the one we come from, and it would have been impossible for us to take the boat that we just come in to get up the hill. Me and my friend head back to explore the island. We headed up the hill and noticed there's a small gorge that led into the lake. It used to be a river but was blocked up by a beaver dam. Me and my friend started to walk through it, and I started to feel uneasy because of the increase of bugs in the gorge, and being slightly afraid of running into a beaver. It turns out my friend was feeling the same too, and we don't know why. He just felt that there was something weird about the lake. We left the gorge and made our way up to the top of the hill. We overturned the boat, and after a few failed attempts of trying to launch the boat, we make it to the lake. Now I must say that I'm almost 6'4" and my friend's 5'7", so it's a challenge to get us in the boat, along with there only being one oar. We eventually made our way to the middle of the lake, aiming for the island, with my friend rowing the boat. We both feel very uneasy, but I put my mind off and try and distract myself a bit. Now, I'm bored, and being in a small boat, see if we could tip over if one of us sneezed for a laugh. We're almost 2 hours away from a town or hospital though, so we're both kind of worried about getting stranded at the time. We're in the middle of the lake with a small swamp in front of us, and a rock face around 20 feet from our left, and the woods to the right. We could see the water around us moving, the wind creating a slight wave. We carefully looked below us to see if we had hit a sandbar, but we didn't see any sand beneath us, just inky black waters of the lake. We put the oar in the water and don't feel any current. We found though that we could move to the left and right, but just not forward. almost like we hit an invisible wall in a game. We both felt that the boat starts to sink down a little, almost like being sucked into the lake. Now, my friend started to row to the right and we make our way to the right, then once near the coast to the island. Far away from the island, seems to be nice and pristine, but once we get closer, it's desolate. The trees are dying, or dead. The island's covered in stone and pine needles and dead lichen, with swamp and decay covering the lake. We managed to tie up the boat next to a dead pine tree, and we spend some time on the island checking it out and looking for anything of interest. After spending some time on the island and running out of bug spray, we decided to head back to the cabin. My friend took the oar and started to prod the water around off the island to find a good place to stay. Around this time, we both get this grave sense of unease. Personally, it felt like dread, kind of mixed with anxiety, like your body saying, "Get out of here now or you're gonna die." We then hear some commotion in the water, and we look around, and 10 feet away from us we see some geese running into the water. And we look around, and right where they've come from, we see what appears to be a black sculpture / scroll behind some rocks. Kind of like a mix, I guess. The closest thing I can describe is the thing in Star Wars when Jawas go behind the rocks. My friend also said he heard a strange noise, but I didn't notice it. We also had noticed too that the lake had gotten awfully still, and that the forest fell silent. We found a good place to port, and we decide we're going to row back. As we start heading back, I look to where we started and see a strange black figure staring at us standing where we left. At this point, I didn't want to point it out, so just start rowing. I row for another 10 minutes and take a short break. But whenever we take a break, we could hear the crushing of leaves and breaking of branches following us in the woods. I hug the coast as we head back. Even when we're staying around 12 feet away from the shore, I can't see the bottom of the lake. We eventually got back and put the boat back where we found it. When we tipped it over, we find scratch marks all over the bottom of the boat as though something clawed it. As we start to leave, we decide to take one last look at the beaver dam. That's where we noticed there was a cave behind the dam. Upon seeing this, we decided to get the hell out and make our way back to the main lake, where we used our walkie-talkies to tell my granddad to come and pick us up. He's out with some hunting friends and we can't even get a signal at first, but eventually find him. Now as we left, I looked back and saw the figure standing on the island later that night too, as me and my friend were at a fire pit next to the cabin. We start hearing strange noises coming from the woods, almost sounding like a person trying to make a hoot sound of an owl. Although this could have just been my grandpa's hunting buddies in the cabin, but why would they do that? Now the land itself used to be Owaja, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any kind of story similar to mine. At first, I'm sorry for any mistakes. English isn't my first language. So as a child, I had a very traumatic experience. You can believe it or not, but this is what happened to me and why I'm still scared of the dark. When I was younger, I can't say exactly how old I was, about 4 I think. My big brother and I loved to camp outside our home. In front of the house there was a small forest. If you went outside, you stood directly in front of this really small forest. There was never anything spooky about it. We even played in it. Even when it was just a steep slope with trees. It was our favourite place to be. Just playing, doing stupid things. Being a child, it was always my favourite place and a happy one. One day, we decided to camp outside again. We built the tent at night and we're inside it keeping warm. Everything looks normal. I'm not afraid at all. Also, brave enough to be like 15 meters to the entrance of a toilet in the middle of the night. I went in. A few minutes later I come back. I don't even look at the forest whatsoever. Do you know the feeling like somebody's watching you? Well, I have that. I had the feeling that I need to stop and look in the forest, so I stopped. I stopped to look at the forest, and there's two glowing red eyes staring back at me. I was frozen in fear, and I ran back to the tent into the safety, shivering in fear. Now, I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't a car because there's no roads nearby, and my brother said he saw them too, so I know it wasn't just me. It couldn't have been a predator because there was no light to make the eyes reflect, and they were far too big. I've literally never seen anything like it, and I always get scared of forests today because of it. There is something my sister experienced about a week ago, which was similar to an experience a friend of hers had a month before. She was sleeping at her boyfriend's house, which backs onto a mountain with a forest starting in his backyard, when she decided to go get herself some food from upstairs. Her boyfriend refused to go with her as he had school in the morning and it's already 1. His room's in the basement, so she went up the stairs to the kitchen, on the same level as the rest of the family's bedrooms. Because she didn't want to wake up everyone else, she used her phone flashlight while she prepared herself bananas and hummus. While doing so, she heard what sounded like large footsteps. It actually sounded like a dog, but they don't have any pets. The door opens and closes about 3 or 4 times before finally closing. Then, the footsteps progress down the hall in her direction to a closet door where the same thing happened. Only this time, the door was left open. She's starting to get freaked out now. She tries to brush it off as a family member and went back to chopping her banana. Out of the corner of her eye though, she saw what appeared to be a very large black figure slowly leaning its way around the hallway corner, trying to look into the kitchen. She looked up, and it's gone. The same thing happened again. Only this time its neck is stretched out longer than before, looking at her. She looks up and finally catches a glimpse of something with white glowing eyes before disappearing around the corner. At this point, she's freaked out and grabs her knife. She quickly went around the corner to turn the light off, before gathering all of her stuff to head downstairs. When she told her boyfriend in the morning, he told her that the closed door is not just a closet door, it's an empty room with the attic door in the ceiling. They went in the room the next day to find that paint had been scratched off the attic door, and the floor was scratched beneath it. A friend of hers had a similar incident a month or so earlier when he was taking a leak in the backyard. He looked up only to see a tall creature with what he described to be glowing eyes and huge teeth standing amongst the trees. Once it notices him, it ran off, but then started coming after him once he started running towards the house. I work out in a very isolated stretch of the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and I've had an alarming amount of strange experiences while out here. The basic thing that happens are humans screaming far away in the woods. It's a really dense rainforest with no trails. Hearing high-pitched voices say 1 or 2 words like again or thank you. Sometimes I'm all alone, and sometimes my boyfriend hears them too. There is a really upsetting presence that sometimes appears to be a tall shadow that crouches and peeks out from behind things in a dumpster area, and all but a couple of co-workers have had unpleasant experiences while taking the recycling out. Another friend saw a face gliding by her window like it was on a skateboard looking in. Until recently, it's been mostly ghost happenings around here, but in the last week, we've had a few things that are different. I mean, like strange lights. The first thing that happened was my boyfriend and I are out in our bedroom and we're flooded with an intense bright light. We just stare at each other for a while, confused as to what this is. The light then flickers on and off and the room went black to pitch darkness. Our room backs off onto a dense forest, and we promptly look outside to make sure nobody's there, as this is a national forest, but there's no one. There's nothing but darkness and no movement. 2 nights ago, a co-worker of ours was returning home late at night when he got out of his car, and he can see an orange light hovering over one of the housing units. It does a couple of loops before popping out of sight. Now, the thing that worries me is that these are becoming more consistent. I spoke to a park ranger and he has no idea what they are either. I hope these stop. So a little while ago, I watched a news broadcast on my local news channel. It's about a woman that went missing 2 months ago. The circumstances of her disappearance were odd. She was staying in a family cabin in the woods, and she said she got in a shootout with 2 men, claiming she shot one in the face. She frantically called her friend and told her these things. The specific things she said is unknown. The police found bullet holes and other evidence that suggests there was a shootout, but they find no blood anywhere, despite her saying she shot one in the face. Her belongings are found, and it's all on the roof, and she's been missing ever since. There's no sense of this, it's like she literally just vanished. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even mist around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now, my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid, and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experiences night hiking, we would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now, the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and past the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road, and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, The clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet, it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail, staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. You'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like, good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone, at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. There's stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, "This feels much longer than it should be," and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, he kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail, whatever it's called, is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both of his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long, and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we're even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we're all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half, when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year, the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012, I was 16 and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "Do you know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this." She mentions, "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 90s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies and the long greasy hair barely holding on the top of the head starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight at my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that There's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions, and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door, and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives, and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances did they touch or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30, and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them. Because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, the trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walked into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe, one hell of a name, were outside all the time when we could manage it. Joe, the real G, lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we're frontiersmen. We'd build lots of traps, shelters, and practice making fires with sticks. Basically the whole 9 yards. Now when we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the rail tracks out in the country, But instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find a cool bridge to fish from, and camp out a little way off the track. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we're probably trespassing, but we're young and kids. Now we had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that nobody went on. We fished, hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was very calm actually. Now after school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd occasionally see each other. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we're both in the same town for about a week. We'd do other stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer and a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day just to walk the trails, camp one night and walk home. The day we decided on, we started out early in the morning. We actually had my wife drop us off in the old spot we used to start in, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave her what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We sat on the bridge and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff before the night set in. We picked a spot to camp in. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train track, and it made you feel as though you're in a tunnel. We brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. Now this is actually what we used to do in the old days. We'd walk the area and make sure that we're not just on some guy's house or something. We walk maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and end up on a small incline. We figured if we don't see anything from the top of this hill, we'll be good. But when we get to the top of the hill, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods, which is barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't appear to be anyone in it. It was quiet, with no movement that we can see, no lights even. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly as we near the building, and we see it's not a sugar shack, but it's an old church. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building with wooden planks that are busting out from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of that place, also weathered and black, looking creepy. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see the inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section for a preacher to stand on. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't wanna. Beyond all that, there were no signs of anyone, not even footprints. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot, and we decided to camp there. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel safe, but we're still a little uneasy. We chalk it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods in the middle of nowhere. Besides, at this point it's dusk and we decide to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep. By this time night set in. Now as we lay in our hammocks, we're talking and we hear something in the direction of the church. What the hell's that? It sounds like people singing. Yeah, I know, man. And it did sound like people singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down. straining to hear more. We listen for a minute or two, and they're singing, but it's not getting louder. We decide to creep back up the hill to see if we can spy on whatever that is. We could move very quietly in the woods. We're used to it from before and it's like second nature now. The moon was barely out and it provided just enough light so you couldn't really see us. We didn't touch our flashlights as we slowly got up the hill, not even whispering. We got to the top of the hill and we see a light in the distance. It was coming from the church. Singing? Well, it's from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and hushed conversations to each other. Can you hear this? I don't believe this. Craziest thing is that the light appears as though it's coming from a candle and flickering. And though we tried, we can't make out what's being sung. It sounded like church music but in another language. We sat there for a while, trying to see who was in there, but only saw occasional shadows. We have no intention of getting closer. We have about a football field's length between us now. The singing has continued for a bit, but stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I'm already freaked out, but this voice scared the life out of me. It sounded like an Old Testament preacher that you see in movies, but again, speaking in another language, we can't differentiate any words. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, then a bunch of voices would answer. This lasted for a while, then they all broke out into the song, which is long and sustained and gets louder and louder. It got so loud it was actually disturbing enough that I covered my ears. It stopped now. At this point, I was getting ready to say, let's get out of here, when Joe puts his hand on my shoulder and says, yeah, they're coming. We're far enough away that we can't make them out really, but we can literally see a line of figures walking out of the hallway, all in single file. Some of them have flashlights and began to sing again. They're moving towards us. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks into the direction we come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, erratically like they're shaking them. We sprint as quick as we can. We eventually stop seeing the lights and come to our road, but our map is really small and we're struggling to read it. We walk for about 15 more minutes and know where we are. We get to a gas station and my wife gets us. Now my wife and other friends say it's just kids messing around, but there was no way kids made them sounds. Not sure who these people were, but it definitely creeps me out. I remember that happening to me in Ohio. I'm doing seasonal work out in the Olympic National Park this summer and live in employee housing on the same property as my job. Throughout the summer, I've heard things like a giggling coming from an empty room and a sliding door that closes on its own. Now one night about a month ago, something wild happened. The building I live in is backed up against an impenetrable coastal rainforest, and some friends and I were sitting in one of the apartment unit cabins chatting when, all of a sudden, we hear screaming coming from directly in the woods. Initially, we thought it's a cougar, but it kept going and was decidedly human sounding. Sometimes it seemed more like a sobbing, and in others it was frantic yelling. It literally goes on for 5 minutes straight, then stops. Now the truly chilling part, about 30 seconds after the yelling stops, we heard what sounded like a disembodied woman's voice coming through a radio that starts muttering right next to where we're sitting. We can't make out what she's saying and it's only for a few seconds, but it's literally in the room next to us, and we can't see anything around. One of my friends opens the door to make sure there's nobody outside and we're completely alone. It should be added that everyone who lives in the buildings were all in the same room. Everything else was empty. Though the voice lasted for a few seconds, it stayed with me forever. When I was about 9, my family was in a big transitional phase. We moved out to a house deep in the woods in the country, and my mother to this day insists that it's haunted. My sleepwalking got really bad in those days, I mean incredibly. Sometimes I'd wake up on dirt, outside, with a blanket wrapped around me. I would look around in darkness for a light, and that would usually be my house porch light. It got so bad that my mum kind of barricaded me in at night with chairs sometimes. What scared me most, however, was not outside in the woods, near the National Forest, no. It was my room. It was on the first floor, and with the layout of the house, it was on a silent, kind of slanted hill. It dug into the ground a bit. It was the closest thing to a basement possible, because it dug into the ground. There was only one window in my room. This window is in the top right corner of my room, and it was tiny. The window was right at ground level outside, so most of the time I would only see thick grass and dirt covering the glass. Sometimes when I woke up in the night though, I would see other things. Often, I saw boots standing there. They would stand there for hours at a time, facing inwards as though someone staring at the wall, facing me. They were steel-toed, or looked like old leather boots. It looked as if they belonged to a man. It was so weird. The boot shifted weight sometimes back and forth, between one side and the other, as though the wearers lean in. The toe area was always scuffed too. I knew that they weren't my mother's or father's. It wasn't sleeping paralysis. I was always able to move in that. I would just sit and stare at these boots until I fell asleep. And for some reason, I always had the urge to never go and tell someone, and I don't know why. My family's already freaking out about the other experiences in the house, so I guess I didn't want to add to it. It stopped when my dad moved. Years later, and with the family camping, and all of us are telling scary stories, my father begins talking about how when he was young, he would have the sensation that something was slowly walking towards him. Has anyone ever seen it in a movie? Yeah, like that. He just explained like a pair of shoes that slowly walked towards him with malevolent intent. He goes on to explain how it stopped when he got older. I get this sour taste in my mouth. I ask my father if they're still toes. He shoots this weird look at me and nods. I say, are they made of old, dusted leather and scuffed at the front? He looks scared now and nods. He said, how do I know? And I explained my story, and he begins freaking out. It was so insane to make these realizations at the same time. And my father's room was right above mine, so someone with average height at that specific spot would have been right through to my dad's window. I've concluded that my father has spirits that follow him. I now know that they weren't there for me. I just hope they can stop. It was mid-December 2010. I was 16. I was off school for the half term and was playing video games all day basically. I lived in a small 3-bedroom semi-detached house. Due to my bedroom being upstairs and fairly small, my mum let me have the back room downstairs as my room too. This had all things in there like my PC, reptiles and guitars. We also had some doors leading into the garden near the forest. One night at around 2 AM, I was playing World of Warcraft and using Ventural talking to my guide friends. Pretty standard night. At the time, my sleeping pattern was awful, and I was staying awake all night playing World of Warcraft. I pretty much always had my back door a little tiny bit open to let some cool air in, due to the heat coming off my computer and to cool it too. This had never been a problem. We lived in a relatively quiet area. Now, our garden backs onto a small wooded area, and the only people I ever seen in there were kids making dens and playing, etc. Nothing really to be scared of. While having headphones in, I can't really hear anything outside, because of the game volume, I mean. I remembered playing and catching something out of the corner of my eye. Now, my PC desk is about 3 feet away from the double doors against the wall. Anybody outside would be able to see me sitting at the desk. I turned and saw a hand opening the door. I froze and remembered spinning around in my chair, ripping out my headphones. This would be a pretty good time to add that I was home alone. My mum and dad were at a wedding party and I was fine staying home on my own. Then a man, who's about 30 years old with a shaved head and scruffy beard, is standing at my door. Well, we kind of stare at each other for a few seconds, and I ask him to close my door and get out of the garden. But he just casually walked in and stood there. I remembered freaking out a little and standing up and moving to the other side of the room. I moved towards a shelf where I had a penknife and took it out and tell him to go away. He then said that, and it chills me, he knew nobody was home, and says let me stay on the couch until my parents' car shows up. I'm freaked the hell out. He got visibly agitated and starts walking around my room looking at my reptiles. I told him that I'm gonna call the police. I remember not being as terrified as I should have been. It was only for the reason what the situation is that I couldn't really understand what was going on. He then said something along the lines of, "You know, I'll stab you long before the police ever get here." I remember then going out to my room and shutting the door behind me, so he's locked in. I never heard him walk to the door or even try the handle. He then starts really pushing on it while screaming at me to move. I weigh up my options. It seemed like the best option would be to run out of the front door and knock on the neighbour's house, but my very small dog was asleep in the bedroom and I'm not going to leave him. I know my dad kept a police cosh in the cupboard in his bedroom, so I sprinted to get it. While rustling in the drawers, I hear him going upstairs. He's now making his way through my parents' bedroom, staring at me through the banister. I'm terrified. He has a steak knife in his hands now, which I didn't see before, and he raises it up to me. I had the cosh and a penknife, but I wasn't confident. He didn't move for a bit until I asked him what he planned to do because this isn't going to end well for us. He told me he's going to go back and walk down the stairs. I heard him go through my room. I hear him slowly go through the other side. I crept back down the stairs, but what made it more intense is for some reason he turned off every single light. Before I got to the bottom of the stairs, I called the police watching the doors to see if he'd come. The police arrived 10 minutes later and my parents shortly after. They searched the woods behind my house and the fencing area, and they found some used needles, gloves, and a huge carpet roll, and about 10 cigarettes in the same place. They suggested he must have been watching me in the dark because it would have a perfect view of my room. And what's worst, they never found him. So this is something that I've kept to myself for over 2 years now, and every time I think about it, all the hairs on my body stand up. Here's something that my girlfriend and I really like to try and forget about. So my girlfriend and I really enjoyed trying to find new hikes in western Colorado. We decided to try a new trail that was not on the national monument, and was far away from any other trail. Was a good deal with the way out of town as well. Anyway, we're on one of the only car parks on the trailhead, and as soon as we're walking it, it gets really dark. Well, we make it all the way until the moon rose, and I stop to hug my girlfriend, Now all of a sudden, further down the road, at least a few miles away, we hear automatic gunfire. It pops, then goes silent, then pops again. Now this kind of thing isn't normal in my area. Now my girlfriend said to me if she thought they were gunshots, and I say I don't think they are. Now we're in the middle of the wilderness at this point. We decided it'd be best to turn back about 2 miles down the trail. Now by this moment we're on top of a very large hill covered in desert shrubs. As soon as we stop talking, we realise something's wrong. All of the insects had stopped chirping, and the crickets had stopped entirely. All of the sounds of nature were gone. My girlfriend was facing further down the trail, and I was facing back the way we come from. She looked behind me and screams. She then starts running. I was already scared, but I figured the worst it could be is some drunk idiot. I turned and looked, and I immediately ran after her. I never ran so fast in my life. The shrubs are about 2 or 3 feet high in varying spots, and when I turned around, I don't know how to describe it, it looks more like a shadow. Even with the moonlight directly shining on it, it's almost absence of any light. Now it's already starting to stand up when I turn around. As soon as it fully rose up, I realised that I was looking up at this thing and it had to be at least a foot taller than me. It had very clear skin, and bones that don't appear to be human. We sprinted back to my car, still with the whole trail being silent. I was in such a hurry when we ran to the car that neither of us realised that I hadn't taken out my keys to open the car. We're halfway through the drive when we realised that. Now every single hair on my body was raised, and even if I'm being honest, I've never felt anything like it. Every fibre of my body told me to get out of there, and I was almost paralysed by fear that washed over me. Does anyone know what this could have been?